this is what I was going to be talking about last year in the keynote. And as we all know, it didn't happen. So this year, going to talk again. Ironically, the talk may be a little bit more relevant now because there have been ongoing developments in these sorts of things that I'm going over. Even like, a few days ago, I'm going to mention things that have happened. So what I really want to do is I want to try to inspire you to new things and opportunities that are ahead. I got into information security. Before I was doing that, I had done community research. My first startup in the early 90s was in fact doing meetings and the like over the internet and working on how you construct spaces for people to do things. And before I did security at all of any sort, I did user experience. And I have recognized that these are things that have become relevant again. And while I enjoy doing InfoSec and cryptography, these past things that I used to do have shown me that the reason that I like security, which is that I like the interactions that people do with computers. And security is all of the interesting rough edges. It is the hard problems, the difficult things that we need to do to try to figure out how to act well together while we share things. And I think that we are moving so that the next opportunity is, in fact, that human beings are wonderful and human beings are awful. And it's just a way we are. And the technology that we have been using to build communities is also the technology that we use for constructing all sorts of other things that aren't particularly good. I mean, right now, for example, my group has been studying bossware, studentware, proctorware, stalkerware. All of these things have a unification underneath them. And also in a lot of cases, the hacking tools that people use are the same things as debugging tools. This isn't a surprise to any of us because, the same tools that you use to, say, reverse engineer something are the tools that you use to debug it. And there are other dualities like that. If you have a disk go bad and you need to get your holiday pictures off of it, this is the same sort of thing as doing forensics on the disk to find other things. So all of these technologies are in fact dual use. So what I want to talk about is really going up the stack from software to human beings, to the stuff that runs in our heads. And one of the things that has been going on is that the way that we have constructed interaction on the internet with user experience, with community building, have led us to where, for example, if I say, oh, I was having a lot of trouble on the health site today, you even know what site it was. And so what do we do about this? Can we use the skills that we have as hackers, as InfoSec people, to make things better? Because the hacker mentality, the InfoSec mentality, the ability to look at things and say what's going to go wrong and predict it and fix things before the problems occur are in fact skills that the world at large needs. So we need you. We need the mad skills that we all have. And there's also the opportunity for people who find this interesting to learn new skills and work with people who have them. There are lots of UX people, there are lots of community builders out there who know what they think they should be doing, but they don't have the same sort of problem discovery skills that we have. And from a personal development point of view, this is new areas with unsolved problems. I got into cryptography because when I was doing stuff like this, collaboration on the internet, there was no SSL. And people said, ooh, I don't really want to like talk about my secret plans when somebody could just sniff them on the internet. And that's what brought me into cryptography. And it's been a whole lot of fun to do security since. But I also believe that the forefront of what's going on for the next 10, 15 years is going to be all about how we do UX and community building to make better systems for people themselves. So how do we build systems so that people don't exploit other people, especially the non-experts, the vulnerable, the easily exploited? And we've made a lot of progress, despite the fact that we have a tendency to look at things and say everything is still broken. It wasn't that long ago when it was a truism of security that physical access was all, that if somebody got to touch a device, that they would own it. And we are at a point now where many of the devices that we have, the things that we carry in our pockets and under our arms, are good enough that it would take a nation state to break them. There's more work that can be done, but this has been great progress. It was considered 2-3 decades ago utterly impossible that we could get this far. So we want to keep the progress that we've made, advance the progress that we've made, but we also want to talk about how we start working on the humans themselves. And that brings me to my segue to the crypto wars. You know, this hasn't changed in like 25 years. The stuff that we were saying in the mid-90s is the same sort of things that we're saying now. And I spent a few years just being, I don't want to talk about it. And thinking about the issues that I'm going to be talking about now, that there are new opportunities, got me reinvigorated. So what we're going to be doing here, what I'm going to talk about, is in fact what has gotten me excited about what is new now and wasn't then. This time there's a whole bunch of changes. In the previous crypto wars, encryption was controlled, governments thought they owned it, and we wanted to use it. The early people who built things like Whit Diffie, Marty Hellman, and others built cryptography because they saw the internet coming, and they saw that when everybody was connected over networks, that you needed to be able to have cryptography there, because that was going to be the only thing that was going to be make it workable. And so now we're at a situation where we have strong cryptography, we have good security, and the other side, the side that wants a surveillance state, wants it closed. But we have the status quo right now, and that is very different. Nonetheless, just like before, they're saying we can only stop bad things through surveillance. We know that this is wrong. They have changed their focus so that they are not after VPNs, they're not after SSL, they're after primarily person-to-person chat, person-to-person communication like this, a certain amount of device security, and also what goes on social media, which really isn't terribly well protected anyway, but there's starting to be a blur between them. There are lots of systems like WhatsApp, Telegram, Signal that are straddling a line between a texting system, a chat system, and a social network. The other thing that is happening is that the internet has made a bunch of bad things differently bad than they were in the pre-internet days. Child abuse, mis and disinformation, inflaming hatred, these are real problems, but they're also the excuses that the forces of surveillance want to be able to break into the security that we all need. And while surveillance is not the answer, I've given that talk before, you've heard that talk before, and we'd all be bored if I gave it again. So that's why I am wanting to go into thinking about new things and new ideas and new ways to explore the frontiers of technology and human interaction for the 2020s and beyond. Another proviso that I have is, in fact, that we're not going to convince them. I'm not going to try. They are not helping a lot of case, or they're blocking the problem. There are ways to solve some of these things through plain old police work, community building on the ground, and their desire for the magic rainbow unicorn key is not going to go extinct. They're still going to want it, and it just doesn't exist any more than unicorns do. And we also know that security is hard. The stuff that I'm talking about, similarly to what we know from software and device security, you can't just go sprinkle the magic security dust on the problem and it goes away. Just like attacks went from simple buffer overflows to ROP and drop attacks, use after freeze, and so on, we're going to have to address the person-to-person security things through a variety of means. And that's also why I think it's interesting, is that there's a whole lot of stuff that we can be doing. And each time we make a little step forward, we can try something else and gradually, as we have been doing in other sorts of security, make things better, but it's going to be a long haul. So let me talk about the way forward. I like GIFs, but I find that GIFs in talks distract the hell out of me. This is the only one I'm going to get. This is where I'm putting my axioms in. My background as a pure mathematician and philosophy person has me think about things where, you know, what are my basics? What is given that I'm not going to give up on? And what are the principles that I use to go forward? And the two things that I want to talk about that is just given is talking to another human being in private is a basic human right. End-to-end encryption is how we do that. We've been sitting at home for the last 15 months, and it's much clearer to everyone now that we need to be able to have private spaces for people to talk to each other no matter where they are in the world, because it's just the way that things got to go. And also, a robot spy is a spy. Arguably, the robot spy is worse than a human spy because it doesn't even have the sort of human intelligence to do any sort of mitigations on what they want. So you need to have person-to-person communication. We want no spies, even robot spies. So I want to look at ways that we can look at systems that could be built and that people are building. What makes them desirable? What makes them undesirable? What governs the really interesting space in the middle where there's a really good idea and you could do this right or you could do this wrong. So we want to think about how you do it right and what would be the places that we don't want to go, because that's how we're going to build the brain level security systems that we need. My first principle is it voluntary? You know, are you doing this because you decided to? This is consent. That a system that people have consented to, something that you've affirmatively turned on yourself, is really good. And in my security and privacy practices that I've done, if someone says this is a voluntary system, they have to turn it on to make it work, I'm going to look at it in a different way than if it was mandatory. And similarly, if it's opt out rather than opt in, it's kind of in the middle where you need to look at it closely, but at least the people who don't like it can turn it off. And where you have opt in and opt out for different situations is part of what the whole building things and constructing them is, because there's places where you want to have totally opt in. And there are places where you want to have a system that you put in place, but to make it so that someone can opt out. The next one is it transparent? Meaning, do we know what's going on in it? Can we understand it? And I don't even mean at the low level, what are the bits and bytes doing? There is the, what do I expect that it's going to do? What do I know about the way that it's going to work? You know, if we think about end-to-end encryption, for example, end-to-end encryption is one where the people who are in the encrypted space are the only ones who have the keys and nobody else has them, including even the service that is running it. And you don't need to know the details of key exchange or anything else. You just need to know that this is the way that it works. I mean, it forms a private space. And there are all sorts of other places where the transparency to know what it's supposed to do is vital, because if you don't really understand what it's going to do, you can't really consent to it. And consent is one of the most important things in there. So beyond that, is it under our control? And this is kind of like, if I am doing something and I don't like it, can I turn it off? There are lots of things that sound really nice and I would like to try, and I want to be able to turn them on and turn them off. You know, like, for example, location things. There are cases where, in fact, I do want to turn on location for a website or an app, because, you know, if I'm asking it, where's the nearest place to get lunch, it's going to be a lot easier if it can just know where I am. And if I turn that off, then that's nice. There are other sorts of control issues that are more difficult because, for example, lots of sites want your address book. And if you give them your address book and change your mind, they're not going to give you your address book back. And similarly, things that want to look at your camera roll, if they look at your pictures and pull them off to their site for whatever analysis, they're not going to give them back. So control is a little difficult and it's really important, but it's one of the places where we get into the really nitty gritty, and there's hard to describe things sometimes. Another one is, whom does this serve? Who's it for? A lot of the systems that are being proposed are not for us, they're for the authorities. This is where I need to get into encryption because bad things are happening. They're pushing it towards it being a thing that is not necessarily on our side. And this is an important way to look at things, is who is doing it for what purpose. Also, is the interactions that you're doing public, private, others? I know that we're talking about end-to-end encryption, and those are typically private spaces, but an awful lot of what we talk about are public or semi-public, and there is a continuum here. When I think about a bunch of encrypted systems, particularly multi-person access systems, I fall back on an old aphorism that is a Ben Franklin one, which is that 3 people can keep a secret if 2 of them are dead. Human beings are really bad at keeping secrets when there's a lot of people who know it. And we know this sort of thing. It's like, you know, one of the ways that you do things, like try to analyze a conspiracy theory, is like, how many people have to keep quiet about it? That's one of the ways that people who try to untangle these, is that the natural human tendency to talk about stuff means that an encrypted chat with 100 people in it is not private in the way that one that has 2 is. And somewhere, you know, 3 people is a lot like 2, but 100 people, oh yeah, somebody's going to blab, or somebody is in there who's an informant or whatever. And this is kind of why you'll see some things like Telegram, which is got the best support for large numbers of people offers end-to-end encryption for only 2 people. And it gets used for things like protests because it is the thing that you can do to manage a group of 10,000, 20,000 people. And you just, that's not going to be secret. It doesn't matter what you do with it. So this is how we look at what's going on, because a public statement is going to have different characteristics in this human brain-to-brain thing than a private statement among 2 people. I frequently start with this, and my coworkers who work with me on things will note that I have a tendency to jump to, well, is this thing actually going to work? And I've pushed it down to, on my list of principles and design goals, number 6, but it's still really, really, really important, because if it isn't really going to work, if it's going to work badly, or if it's going to work only partially, it's a different system. And particularly when we look at how we want to do things, if it's not going to work, why are we doing it to begin with? Also, is something that we're going to be doing necessary and proportionate? If we are going to shape human behavior, is there a reason for what we're doing, and are we doing things in a useful and humane and respectful way? So this is also one of those things you're going to see me work on a little bit when we look at stuff. And the last most important thing is, what about mission creep, or the slippery slope? And there are lots of really good ideas that are there, but we know that we're going to start off using it for this one little exception case, and it's going to be the next little exception case, and it's going to be another one, and then we're going to be having this thing being used everywhere. And when it's being used everywhere, it's not appropriate at all, and thus we push back on any use of it, because it's going to be hard to stop. And we see this sort of thing go on in social systems that we build all the time, where abstractly it's not a bad idea, but we know that this is not where things are going to stop. And also, this isn't a complete list. I'm sure that you have something, or someone has something that I didn't think of, and if you tell me, what about blah, 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 I'm going to say, oh yeah, that's really good. So there's going to be more ways to look at stuff, but this is enough to start with. So I want to look at these things. I want to look at some ways to deal with systems that people have proposed. I'm going to start with 2 obviously bad ones, move on to an obviously okay ones, and then kind of wander more to the squishy middle, to where we're going to have things that are not bad ideas, but you could do them well or you could do them poorly. And if you did them poorly, they could be something that we would all tear our hair out and say, don't do that. So this is where I want to go to look at the things that people have been talking about. The first one is my old friend, the ghost proposal. This was a GCHQ proposal that came out a couple of years ago. I wrote, when I was at the ACLU, a long set of essays on it that was all about how to break it. And I showed that architecturally, you could just about always detect that this transparent user that people want to bring in could be detected, and in a lot of cases you could lie to it. So this idea is, take every chat system and essentially, make it so that a secret person can enter into the room at any time. It's not voluntary, it's not proportionate, there's no control on it, it doesn't serve the user, it's not proportionate to wire everything in the world so that you could have a spy come in, and it's going to have lots of mission creep. And as I said, I truly believe that it wouldn't even be effective. So it fails on nearly everything that we talk about here. So-called client-side filtering, because this has been the proposal where if we're going to have end-to-end encrypted systems and thus you can't have the spy in the middle, what if you put the spies on the edges? And frequently this means putting something like PhotoDNA, which is a fuzzy matcher for images, into it. And again, I copied the "it's not voluntary and proportionate, etc." from the previous slide. It fails on the principles that we want something to have. And arguably mission creep is the biggest issue here. An aphorism that I have given on this is that you start off wanting to block CSAM, which is child sexual abuse material, and you end up blocking pictures of Winnie the Pooh. If you are not familiar with that, the Great Firewall of China blocks pictures of Winnie the Pooh. And the reason is that Winnie the Pooh has been used to kind of mock Chairman Xi. It started with a meme that had a picture of Xi and Obama walking together in approximately the same postures and position as Winnie the Pooh and Tigger from the cartoons. And everybody went ha 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 on it. And their systems block Winnie the Pooh because Winnie the Pooh hurts the chairman's feelings. And that's the mission creep problem. You start off with something that might make a lot of sense and you end up with insanity. So now we're going to go, what's obviously okay? Well, spell check. Spell check doesn't ruin end-to-end encryption the way that having a spy in the room has. And, similarly, grammar checking, autocorrect or autoduck, as I often call it. And it's voluntary. It's mostly transparent. We know what it does, even though in a lot of these systems, there's some reasonably complex AI for what it will do for suggesting words for you. But, we know how it works, and it does really nice things for us. And among the things that autocorrect does for us is that you can blame your own typos on autocorrect. I've done this. I mean, you've probably done it too, is that, it's like, oh, I didn't misspeak. Darn you, autocorrect. So this is a tool that we use in our communication systems to make our communications better. It's operating for us. It's not doing anything untoward. Obviously good, just like the other ones were obviously bad. Now then, like contact discovery restrictions. This is orthogonal to end-to-end encryption. It's not about end-to-end encryption at all. Ever since we have had a lot of systems, you've been able to use them to call people that you don't know or contact people you don't know out of the blue. The postal system lets you send mail to any address. You can dial any phone number. You can do other things. And we're starting to move to controls on things in ways that are not intuitive because we've lived with a century of open contacts. And all of the mobile operating systems have an option for turning off unsolicited calls and sending them straight to voicemail. And the reason for this is that when you apply computers that make things be drastically cheaper, robocalls, spam emails, other things become possible and somewhere between annoying and abusive in ways that it wasn't in previous modes of operation, particularly when you were paying per call or paying per minute. And open contact discovery on today's internet is an invitation to abuse. One of my friends who is a great pro-encryption blogger and thinker flat out said, open contact discovery is inviting abuse of women. People of color, etc., are subjected to things on the internet. Piling on happens to anyone who speaks unthinkingly. And there's a lot of ideas that we could have for how we would rethink this, because the simplistic one is things like, send the phone call to voicemail. But how do we want to manage who can get into somebody else's DMs, etc.? And this is one of the opportunities where somebody should have a good idea, and we're going to get it right and we're going to get it wrong, and we're going to see changes, and it'll be different in 10 years than it is now. So, darting back a little bit, it's not really the best pithy term, advanced sender editing, but we've seen this, and it could be good or bad, and it's coming in a lot of systems. Like Twitter has just put in a system where it can advise you on your tweets whether or not they might offend other people. There was a new feature just last week that Tinder, the dating site, came up with, where they were going to be having editing systems looking for stuff, because they're seeing a lot of things where there's drive-by abuse of people, hurling insults and epithets at people, which also gets back to the how do you contact people. And the place that we need to think about these are, in fact, is it more like spell check or is it more like a spy? Because I would appreciate having tools that would tell me stuff, because communication on the internet can be difficult. I mean, it's like I was reading an article the other day about the connotation of when you end text message with a period or without one, and how that conveys an equivalent of tone of voice. So I can imagine having a machine learning assistant that could help me automatically if I'm someone if I know that I'm a bit brusque, if I know that I'm prone to snark that other people treat as being dismissive, that it would be nice to have an assistant who could help me edit what I do. I mean, it's like every time I write anything, I have a friend or someone look over what I'm doing, because that's the best way to find out that you have stupid mistakes in there. And there's all sorts of ways that we could have assistants who could help us speak better. The context for them is something that governs how appropriate something would be. I mean, for example, in a dating app, I can see a far more draconian, you must use a system that vets what you're doing, because a dating system is not a general purpose chat system. It's where people are trying to go meet each other. And, and you want to help them be on some approximation of their best behavior. So having an editing system is more appropriate than in a general purpose one. So I really like this, but this is one of those things where I would love to see somebody start working on ML enhanced sending systems to know whether or not what I said was good or not. Now, the flip side of this is receiver tools. There are small versions of this that we see already. I mean, it's like I quoted from Twitter, more replies, some offensive. Sometimes you want to see them, sometimes you don't, and at least you've been warned. When I first was talking to someone about, well, couldn't we do this? And we were talking about this at a conference over lunch. And the person I was talking to said, oh, I see. You're saying that we could have the mansplaining filter. And I thought, yes, absolutely. Why not? I mean, there's all sorts of stuff that goes on, you know, mansplaining, unsolicited, dick pics, trolling, insults, you name it. Why not have an ML assistant that tells you, maybe you should look at this when you're in a good mood, you're in a hurry right now. I can tell you're between meetings. You should look at this later. And this is going to be fraught. The history of spam fighting shows us that guiding and corralling potentially unwanted communications is hard. There are all sorts of ways that people got it wrong in the early days of spam fighting, and they're gonna get it wrong the very same way as they start to build these things. But you know, why not? I mean, I would love to see an environment where different people were making different sorts of sender tools and receiver tools that we could plug into our systems to help us be more pleasant to be around. Another big one that's coming is advanced blocking and reporting tools. We've seen that some tests that people have done is that if you make it easier to block, if you make it easier to report, if you make it easier to shape how someone talks to you, that this has really good effects on the civility of the environment. There's also some really interesting cryptography that has been used here. For example, Facebook came out with a thing called message franking, which is a way that you can have a private encrypted conversation and release pieces of it when you want to talk to you about it. So, you know, Alice talks to Bob and Alice insults Bob, and Bob wants to report Alice, but Bob also wants to prove to the moderator that Bob didn't just make this up. I've also seen some papers coming out of Stanford where they're doing more advanced cryptographic release of systems so that moderators, editors, and others can effectively allow people to be private together and still have some sort of incident response to people being mean to each other. And again, you know, note, these are the parallels to what we've seen before. You know, how you do incident response in break-ins, in malware, in any sort of vulnerability and exploit, these sorts of things have their analog when we move from the software to the people. There have also been things in places where, like in India, where they have been proposing various laws where they want to have provenance on information that is being done. Personally, I think that they're wanting a little too much here. I mean, if you remember email, remember when you forwarded email, you got the indents on them. You know, when you got those horrible jokes and the stupid things from your elderly relatives that you could see that, oh yes, it came from that person, didn't it? And so marking provenance on messages that go around some sort of encrypted social network like a large chat system is actually useful because it permits people to know what's going on. It gives people the tools to defend themselves. And they could be cryptographic, they could be just textual. I was a couple of weeks ago in a session where we were talking about political misinformation, and someone had this brilliant idea, and they said, what if you could invite in a chatbot that would be able to do things like debunk misinformation. What if you went into a chat room and you're talking to people and you said, let's actually find out what the WHO says about vaccines. Hey, let me bring in the WHO chatbot. Oh, WHO chatbot, what are the safety considerations for blah, 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 blah? Thank you, you can go now. This is a sort of thing that also could be done right, could be done wrong. But when I heard this, I thought, ooh, what an interesting idea. Because this gets to the idea of what we're talking about, which is that we want to be able to shape communication while maintaining the integrity of a secure space where it is just us talking. And I'm not really sure how this is going to work. I mean, this is definitely a research project and a whole bunch of other stuff, but I like the idea. I want to see if somebody could make this thing be viable. There's also lots of other small things that people have talked about. User experience friction is one of those things that we know that if you do things and you make something be harder to do, people do it less often. If you're seeing a thing where in, for example, WhatsApp, people are forwarding around misinformation, and that is inflaming hatreds, other horrible things, you could make it harder to forward things. We know that there's a steep drop-off. I mean, that's a lot of what this engagement style things is doing, is that they're making it easier to share, and there are going to be places where what we would want to do is the opposite, to make it be harder to share, because that's better for the overall way that things are going and de-escalates anger and tension. Group size limits. This has been very interesting because they're all over the place. Like I mentioned before, on Telegram, you get end-to-end encryption on only 2 people. iMessage is 33 people. WhatsApp is, I think, 256. I have heard that they're thinking about even bringing it down smaller. Signal's 1,000. That, as I was noting, as you get more people into a conversation, the idea, the fact that it is technically encrypted matters less. You're going to have people who are going to talk out of turn. I already mentioned forwarding annotations. These are things that we could make small UX changes that are designed to give people the information that they need to make better decisions themselves, and also to be able to defend themselves, along with things that we mentioned in the past. It's like a lot of these things together could start to make us have spaces that are both secure, end-to-end encrypted private spaces, and yet we have something that is like community management going on in them. So what we're really doing here is that we're reconsidering the way that we have people interact. And when I have been thinking about this, I get reminded of, like, the old days before when a PC had only one address space and apps could stomp on each other. And then we gradually got things to be more secure and put isolation in place and thought about what we were doing. Advanced techniques like, ASLR, kernel mitigations, moving drivers out of the kernel, isolating dangerous bits of code like codecs. We started doing these things, and I think they all have analogs to what we do when we're building human systems. We have built our systems for the last few decades with the assumption that, of course, you want to talk to anybody who wants to talk to you, when in fact, we all know that, in fact, we don't. So the fact that there are people we don't want to talk to. Some people are just jerks. Some people are spammers. We all have a bad day when we say something that we didn't really mean. How do we build de-escalation systems? How do we build things that help make it be not a hell site cage match, but make it be a place that we look forward to going to again? And those of us who have InfoSec skills can work with the people who do UX, people who do community management, people who understand psychology, persuasion, and other things, so that we design our systems in a different way so that they become just nicer places to be. Now, tying a lot of this up together, again, secure communication is a basic human right. Human beings need to be able to talk in private with other human beings. We do not deal well with isolation. It's like, you know, as if after 15 months of pandemic, I have to tell you that humans don't do well with isolation. And while end-to-end encryption means there are no spies, it does not mean that we can't encourage things that have in it some sort of communication self-defense so that we can take care of ourselves better. And of course, there's going to be all sorts of opportunities for people to do utterly brilliant things, and the inevitable large number of face-palming mistakes that we're all going to giggle over, because we saw those before in other places too. This is no different. We have to learn how to build systems differently than we were building them before. And that means that we're going to experiment. We're going to do some great stuff and do some really horrible stuff. So that's what I wanted to talk about. And I know that this is a different talk than what a lot of ones are, because really what I want to do is I want to say that for those of us who come to places like this, there are these new opportunities in place that I was fortunate enough to be in the right place at the right time, to be on sort of the ground floor of encryption going everywhere. And large amounts of it were just plain luck and taking advantage of an opportunity. And so I want to say, I see this great opportunity where the sorts of skills that we have help the skills that other people have, and that we can learn these new things. Because, you know, it's like I was a UX person who learned about crypto. You can be a security person who learns about user experience and community things too. It's a lot of fun when you can build things that make a difference. So that's my talk. And if there are questions, brickbats you want to throw at me, cries of anguish, we got like about almost 10 minutes to talk.
However, for the questions, etc., we are going to divert those to the studio. So immediately after this, John has already agreed. He has been very generous with his time. He will be joining us in the HITB studio with Dylan and Shreeman to answer any questions that you may have.